You can start now.
All right, welcome everyone. Can everybody hear me? Thanks for coming out. I've prepared a couple of slides to talk about some of the shoe research that we have been doing here at UMass and also within the Institute of Advanced Life Sciences. So let's get into it. So over the past, less than half a year ago, the world records were broken in both the marathons for the men and for the women. But obviously records get broken every now and then, so it might be just a coincidence that both of these records were just recently broken. So to take another view at this, I prepared a slide with all the women who ran a sub 2:18 marathon between 2005 and 2017. And I'm not sure why it's not showing. Well, actually, I do know, because there's non-women who actually ran that fast in that time period. So if you take another look at this, these are the 25 fastest marathon times ran by women. And in this case, I highlighted only the ones that were run over the past 5 years. And you can see that it's 22 of them. There's only 3 other ones that have been run by athletes not in the past 5 years. So maybe something is going on recently that might result in some of these records. And one of those things that I'm going to be arguing today that could be the cause of this is the fact that in the spring of 2017, the first super shoes were released. And these are carbon fiber shoes with carbon fiber plates and fancy foams. As you can tell from the women's world record in the marathon or the lead performances, they might have boosted some of those. It's not just the women. There's just another very similar graph. These are the men, 25 fastest performances in the half marathon. Exact same story. 22 out of them were all ran in the past 5 years since those shoes came out. And then there's a couple of them that are older than that. As Lars Blackman would say in the early 90s, it's got to be the shoes, right? So this would be a good time for me to officially declare disclose my conflict of interest potential. So some of the research I will be presenting today has been financially supported by some of the big running brands. My work from 2015 to 19 by Nike. Since I moved to UMass, that has been Saucony for a couple of years, and right from the start with Puma, and that is still ongoing. All right, so let's talk a little bit about super shoe science. So this super shoe came out and people are running faster, and it would be nice to relate the two rather than looking at correlations. So actually, the question is there some research that actually shows that these shoes might be better? There is. So we did this study back when I was in Colorado, where we compared this traditional racing shoe on your left, against a Nike prototype shoe, which was basically the first prototype of a super shoe. And we saw at that time that shoe was helping. I'm not going to go into too much detail now. Since then, that white prototype shoe has been sort of re-imaged by different brands and different companies in their own ways, and now these are basically the shoes that people are wearing to run fast races. So we went from very small, lightweight on the left to very bulky, bouncy, carbon fiber plated shoes. So before we go into detail of the rest of the presentation, want to sort of see what are some of the differences between these shoes. So at the top, you see our traditional racing flat from common until like 2015 towards some of the more recent super shoes. So who of you can see some of these differences? One, Dane.
Oh, do you want me to? Oh, the stack height is larger?
Largest stack height. Any other differences that people know about or can see in this picture?
The colors?
Colors, that's one thing. That's more of psychology.
It looks like that toe box is lifted. It doesn't look like as much ground contact.
Perfect. So one of the things you can't necessarily see here is that it's a different foam. There's a carbon fiber plate embedded that you can see in some of these, not all of them. And then the geometry, like pointed out, we got a taller stack height, so thicker midsole, and a 4-foot rocker. The toe box is springing up more. And I'm going to cover all of these and see if we know whether and how they improve running performance. And then eventually I'm going to be talking a little bit more about what I think is going to come up next and projects that we're working on and projects that the shoe industry is probably working on. All right, so I'm going to divide kind of the shoe science in three things that we generally do. So the first is mechanical testing. Then we can do running biomechanics and eventually running economy. So mechanical testing is something that we actually do in this building where we have a shoe and we put it in a machine that presses down on the shoe and measures how much is the shoe deforming and how much energy is stored and being returned. So if we particularly load a shoe with a known force and we purposely actually load the shoe with the force that people apply when they run, so let's say that's about 2,000 newtons, we can measure how much the shoe deforms. So you get this loading rate. And then, interestingly enough, because this foam is not a perfect coil spring, when you unload the shoe, it's going to push back, but slightly less hard. So you lose some energy in the physicalistic behavior of the shoe. And we can quantify that. So when we load it, plot this line, we get the energy that we put in the shoe. Then when we unload it, you can see it pushes back slightly less hard, which means that the area between those lines is actually the energy that we lose. And that also means that the area under the bottom line is actually the energy that the shoe returns. So this is very helpful, and we usually do that by compressing the shoe because we can measure accurately how much it deforms and how much it returns, but we load it vertically. So for this original study that we did back in the day with the first super shoe prototypes, if you look at your traditional EVA foam, this is basically the foam that the vast majority of shoes was made of until 2015, and still nowadays is very popular foam in running shoes. You can see under this 2,000 newtons, it deforms about 6 millimeters, but you also see that there's quite some energy loss. The area between the line is quite large, so we're losing 35% and we're getting 65% back. Then foam innovation, Adidas developed another foam, TPU based. It's their Boost brand foam. It deforms about the same. So in this case, they went with a stiffness that's very similar, but because the foam has better elastic properties, you can see that that area is slightly smaller and the shoe returns slightly more energy. In this case, almost 76%. And then we go to this new modern foam prototype. And we see that under the same load, it deforms way more. So not only is this foam maybe more resilient, but at first we see that it deforms more. So it means it's less stiff. And then secondly, we see that that area between those lines, between the black line, is also smaller. So in this case, we see that it returns 87%. So this was an important thing that kind of got overlooked with the whole debate about the carbon fiber plate, and we get back to that later. But the important thing here is that modern foams are a lot more resilient because they return more energy. And at that point, it also is worth making it more foam and making it softer, because if you have a softer spring, you load it with the same amount of energy, you actually get more energy into it and more energy back. Back in the day when the foams were pretty lousy, you didn't want to make these foams very soft because you would just be wasting energy. But now the foams are very bouncy. Actually, it's worthwhile to make them softer because they bounce more with the same load. All right, so that's sort of what went into it, and this is what we can do when we do mechanical testing. Obviously, as we see, we can do compression testing where we vertically load the shoe and measure this. We could also do bending testing where we assess how stiff it is in bending with these carbon fiber plates. But as you can see from Herland running here, he's not necessarily purely vertically loading his shoe or isolated bendedly. He's like landing here and then rolling off. So it's a little tricky for a machine to simulate that. So we don't necessarily can know or take the values that we get out of the machine at face value. Like we can characterize the shoe and the material, but what happens when the shoe is on a person's foot might be slightly different. So then we can look at running biomechanics and we get a better idea of how the shoe behaves when it's on the runner's foot. So let's do that. So we got Herland running. In the background, you see our cameras here, where we measure where his legs are. He has these reflective marker balls on his legs with a white bandage around it. And he's running on a force instrumented treadmill where we measure the ground reaction force. So if you look at the diagram in the center, when we measure the ground reaction force, we know the forces that the runner is applying to the ground or the treadmill, which is helpful. We can get a measure of forces, but since we also measure where his leg is, in this case, we can get the center of his ankle joint from the reflective marker ball at his ankle joint. And now we have the moment arm of the ground reaction force around the ankle. And this, we have the magnitude of the force, so we can calculate the moment at the ankle. Since we know the moment arm of his Achilles tendon, we can now get an estimate of the forces that his calf muscles are producing to have him run, right? So this is what we do a lot in biomechanics, do all these moment analyses, and we can get an estimate of forces that muscles are producing, which is cool, but also at the same time, it's not necessarily telling us whether it's harder or easier to run. Cool thing is humans are very complicated other than machines. So if we know the forces, it still might not take more energy to produce more force. The amount of energy it takes to produce force also depends on how quickly are the muscles shortening, what is their length, are they close to their optimal length or are they already stretched, things like that. And then there's the tendons as well. So how much is the tendon actually elastically storing and returning? It's a little hard to say all of that just looking from the outside. So that's where biomechanics by itself is still really informative of what might be going on, but we can't make definitive conclusions about how hard it is to run from it by itself. One cool thing that we did though, using this biomechanical analysis, is to answer the question about whether these plates in these shoes are actually functioning as a spring or not, because we can sort of do a couple of measurements and sort of look into what's happening. So here we're looking at the metatarsal phalangeal joint, which is the joint between your midfoot and your toes. And when you run, particularly during push-up here, there's a lot of flexion, so that's where the lines go down. And then towards the very end, you can see that the lines go back up, and that's right there where there is this push-up. And then the question is the plate acting as a spring that actually providing this extra push going back up again? So from the ground reaction forces and the joint locations, we can calculate these moments. I just gave you an example. If we have the moments and the joint angle and the joint angular velocity, the change in joint angle, we can calculate the joint power. So this graph, you can see that the MTP joint during the push-off has a lot of negative power, which means there's a lot of energy loss. But right at the end, you can see this small orange blip where it's just positive. And that is actually some positive power output at the MTP joint. We still don't know whether that is the foot or the plate because we measured this on the outside. We just look at the runner wearing the shoe. But we know that between the toes and the foot muscles and the shoe, there's a little bit of positive power at the end. Now, the other thing is we have our mechanical testing, and we actually know that if you flex this shoe with a specific angle, how much resistance it's providing. So if we take the numbers from those tests and combine it with how much it's deforming from the camera view, we can then calculate how much the moment or the resistance in the shoe by itself is going to be. So we did that estimate and then combined that with the change in angular position. We now can see how much the shoe bending or the plate is helping in this power. And as you can see, it changed some of the magnitude of the values on the y-axis. But here is your answer. I lost my mouse. But on the right, you see that the orange line towards the end has another positive flip, indicating this is where the shoe actually returns some of the energy that it stores early on, where it's negative. I really want my mouse back. So here there's energy stored, and here there's energy released. But the magnitude here is fairly small. So if we quantify that, you get the energy return, and we have to confirm the plate acts as a spring. However, that's only producing about 0.16 joules per step, which doesn't mean a lot to any of you, but it's not a lot. We'll see more about that later. All right. I've been saying a couple of times already, we really care about whether it's harder or easier to run with these shoes. And we can get some indications from doing material testing. We can get some indications from looking at the biomechanics and making assumptions about the forces that the muscles are going to produce and how costly that is. But there's another way to evaluate how hard it is to run, and that is by directly measuring the metabolic energy it requires to run. And we do that in our field by measuring running economy, where we measure the oxygen uptake of a runner. And we know people use this oxygen to metabolize carbohydrates and fatty acids. And from that, we know how much metabolic energy they're using. So running economy throughout this talk and in general is defined as the metabolic rate at a specific submaximal running velocity. Here it's important that it's submaximal, such that when we measure oxygen uptake, which is an aerobic source, we're only evaluating, that's only representative of the total amount of energy it takes to run if you're at a submaximal aerobic steady state. You can think of running economy also as like a car's gas mileage. If you're using less gas to cover miles, you're more efficient. So a runner with a better running economy uses less oxygen or less metabolic energy to run at a specific velocity. It's not the same as your VO2 max. Your VO2 max is your system, your body's total maximum capacity to actually utilize oxygen to provide muscles with energy and do performances, which is both measured from oxygen uptake, except we're focusing for running economy on submaximal, where we can see differences between shoes. And we're not going to ramp them up all the way to their max, which is more of a property of the runner rather than a difference between shoes. And the nice thing about this is that we can easily compare shoes by having people run 5 minutes in different pairs of shoes and measure their running economy, as opposed to giving people a pair of shoes, ask them to run a marathon, and after them finishing, give them another pair of shoes, ask to run another marathon and see if they run any faster. Obviously, you can see that there's going to be some issues with that kind of approach. And there's enough scientific background now to know that running economy is a very good predictor of running performance. So in this case, if you have two runners, they have an identical maximum oxygen uptake, identical lactate threshold, the runner with the better running economy will be running faster over a race. Similarly, if you have an individual and they're having their own maximum oxygen uptake, lactate threshold, we can improve their running economy, they will be running faster. All right, so that's kind of the tools that we have available in our quest to answer which shoes are better and why. So let's dig into why. So I have to start back with this paper where we first look into the first prototype of super shoes. What we did then, we measured running economy, which was our main outcome of interest. Like I said, that's what we care about. And we took the two most used competitive marathon shoes at the time. So at that time, the 10 fastest marathons were all run in shoes of these two models or their predecessors. So we started out with the best shoes on the market for marathon running and elite performance. And then we compared that against our new prototype. So here you can see that the gray lines are the metabolic data for individuals, and the solid black line is the overall average with the Nike Streak was one of the models and Adidas Boost the other one. And you can see that between these, there's no consistent changes, and on average, the values are exactly the same. And if we bring in our new prototype, we can see that all 18 runners increased or improved their running economy. They reduced the cost of running. All of them reduced it. On average, the group average was 4%. It was important to know that all of them improved, and this was at 14 kilometers per hour. We saw exactly the same at 16 and 18 kilometers per hour. So consistent across speeds, we saw that they all improved, and on average, this was 4%, which Nike then liked and put in the name of the shoe. Obviously, that was a study. You got a lot of pushback because, like, Nike funded the study, you're a sellout, blah, blah, blah. But luckily, soon after, other people were like, oh, this is intriguing. Let's see if we can sort of see what they messed up. And then they did a very similar study. Again, here they had different shoes, but the important ones are the second shoe, which was our Adidas Control shoe, and the fourth shoe was our Nike Vaporfly shoe. We had the prototype. They had the store-bought version a couple of months later. And you can see that, again, across speeds, for all these participants, the super shoe was always better. Also, in this case, I think it was exactly 4%. And in this case, they also tested both men at 14, 16, and 18 kilometers per hour, and women at 14, 15, and 16. And throughout all of them, they saw a group level, a good 4% improvement. And obviously then, based on scientific findings and also these results that I showed earlier, all of these brands got on board with this idea, and they all started building their own super shoes with different versions of the foam, slightly different carbon fiber plates with different geometries. Might have been some patent issues there where they had to design around the existing patent, but still could implement a carbon fiber plate. And then all of them, kind of what we talked about earlier, taller stack height because they have more foam, it's more bouncy. It's nice to make this foam softer. But if it's softer, you also have to have more of it because otherwise you're gonna bottom out the foam earlier. So what's going on with that foam and that plate? We did this shoe, obviously it was the thing that was not really controlled in our study was that we didn't look at just the foam or just the plate. We just took the best marathon shoes we could find and the new prototypes, and they were different in at least 4 or 5 different aspects. So then the big question was, is it all about the plate? Because that got a lot of attention. And there is a carbon fiber plate in these shoes, but there's also this modern foam. And as I showed you earlier, we had some indication to quantify the energy return from the carbon fiber plate, and we saw that that was 0.16 joules per step. We also had compressed the foam vertically in the machine, and at that point, we actually saw that the area under the curve here for the energy returned is about 7.5 joules per step. So that's about 50 times higher. So mechanically, from these assessments, it suggests that the foam is contributing a lot more to this improved running economy than the plate. But we still weren't necessarily satisfied because nobody was necessarily believing that. The plate got still a lot of the attention. So we were like, what if we can just compare these shoes with and without plates? Asked Nike about that several times. They did not want to give away their secrets, nor shoes without a plate. So we had to apply some cutting-edge technology. Literally, we took these shoes to the table saw and cut different slices through the carbon fiber plate, such that after we were done, this is the original, and the cut version had a lot lower bending stiffness. So now we got a stiff shoe with an intact plate, and we got a more flexible shoe where the plate is actually cut. And then we were wondering, well, if the bending stiffness of the plate or the recoil of the plate is so important, we sort of disabled that. So we're probably going to see a lot less good running economy. So here we have the data for the subjects that we tested. So on the left, we got the Vaporfly intact, and we measured running economy, and we hypothesized that if this plate is so important, it should make up at least 2% of the 4%. So we would see an increase of at least 2% by cutting the plate. Turns out we did not see a significant increase at all. It was about 0.5%, and it was not significant, suggesting that maybe the bending stiffness of that plate is not that important at all. Obviously, the plate was still there, so maybe the plate is interacting with the foam in a different way. We couldn't necessarily answer that question. But this again indicates that it's mainly the foam. Still not satisfied with this, because like I said, the plate could still have another function. It would be really nice if we could just look at super shoes where we control the stack height, the geometry, and the only difference that we have is we have a traditional foam, a modern bouncy foam, and we have plate or no plate. So Saucony was excited about that idea as well, so they provided us with these shoes that went into Damien Perry's master's thesis or project. So what did we see here? So first gonna go focus on the difference between no plate versus with a plate, and we see that on average, running economy improves about 1%, but we do see that for the EVA shoe, that difference was a lot bigger than for the PIVA shoe. Actually, it was significant only for the EVA shoe and not for the PIVA shoe. So adding a plate to an EVA shoe is helping running economy by 1.3%, and adding it to the PIVA shoe only by 0.6. Interestingly enough, that 0.6 is awfully close to that 0.55 that we found when we cut the plate. And again, when we cut the plate, we're also talking about a PIVA shoe. So these are very equivalent, indicating that a plate is helping, but if it's within this fancy foam, it might not be helping that much. Then if we compare the foams, we saw an equivalent situation where improving the foam from an old foam to a new foam without a plate increased energy running economy improved it by 1.3%. If there was already a plate in the EVA shoe, it only improved it by 0.6%, again, not significantly, which kind of goes totally against our original hypothesis, which was we thought, well, based on the literature going into these super shoes, that there's going to be an effect of the plate, and there's going to be the foam, and then there's going to be some magic interaction where a foam with a plate is going to be even better than a foam without a plate. But we didn't see that at all. So we didn't see that the sum of the total was bigger than or the effect of total was bigger than the sum of its parts. It was actually smaller. So you would assume if you add up the 1.3 with the other 1.3, you got a 2.6% better, but that wasn't the case. So overall, so far, this shows that there's no magic factor. It's actually less than adding them up, but also that the secondary intervention is worse or not as much better. And that at this overview, it looks like the plate and the foam are about the same amount of importance, both 1%. There's one caveat though: if you add a plate, you always make the shoe a little heavier. Versus if you add a modern foam, you always make the shoe slightly lighter because the modern foams are also less heavy. And since we know that shoe mass by itself has an effect on running economy, we can sort of correct these numbers and see that for the actual non-mass balance scenario, using the foam and making the shoe slightly lighter is going to have a bigger effect than adding a plate and making it slightly heavier. Again, still small differences, but it seems to be all in line with what we keep on seeing, is that the foam is going to be more important than the plate. All right, so let's focus on the other two things that were noticed. So we talked about the shoes also come with a bigger stack height. And part of me already, I said that because the foams are also more resilient, they're more bouncy, we can make them softer, but if you put the same force on a softer foam, it's gonna deform more. So it's good to have more foam to allow for the deformation. So that's part of the reason why there's an increase in stack height. But there's also this idea that just by making the shoe thicker, you're basically giving people longer legs. And if people have longer legs, they might use less energy. And there's some evidence across the animal kingdom, if you plot effective leg length against the energy cost of locomotion, you see that animals with longer legs towards the right use less energy to locomote. So that was an interesting idea. So Monty took that task on him to evaluate this question, with the idea being if you make these shoes really tall, the legs get longer, and they get a slightly longer step just for free. That would be nice, right? So in this case, we went with a traditional EVA foam because we wanted to make sure that the foams weren't necessarily compressing a lot, and it actually was effectively making people's legs longer. You had to add a bunch of weights, again, to the normal shoe to make it as heavy as the tall shoe. Again, correcting for this potential mass effect. So what did he see? Contrary to our hypothesis that longer or taller shoes will make your legs longer and save you energy, metabolic cost actually did not go down. You could say that it almost went significantly up. Again, or in this case, confirming it's definitely not helping. It might actually make it worse. You need a lot more. Don't have time to talk about all those details here. But I just want to go back to the idea that just by giving people taller shoes, you make their legs longer, they use less energy. That by itself is probably already flawed from a biomechanical perspective. If you think about when you place your foot on the ground, you still have to rotate your center of mass over your foot. So if you have a longer leg, then here. There you go. If you have a longer leg on this side, you can see that this guy, which in this case would be our glute muscles, would have a harder time pivoting around the point of contact because the moment arm is larger again. So although it works across the animal kingdom within a person by changing their shoes, even if you would get a longer leg, your butt muscles still have to work harder, so it's not necessarily gonna give you just a longer step for free. And what about this forefoot rocker? Again, Sakni was willing to help figure this out. This is her lens study, where basically we started from the Saucony and then an Endorphin Pro shoe, which is on the market. And then we asked if they could make a similar shoe where they put the rocker apex more forward, so closer to the toes. And then we were also worried that if it's just made out of foam, maybe the foam collapses. So we wanted to make sure that we could leverage that difference in rocker by also extending the plate. So here it's the same shoe, the rocker apex is more forward, but we also made the plate a little longer to make sure that the foam just wasn't collapsing and it's actually enforced by the plate. And then on the other end, we tested the shoe where we put the rocker apex further backwards, which would mean you would be rolling off slightly sooner, and maybe that would help. Now the results get really interesting. So all right, ahead of time we were thinking if you put the rocker further back, you're going to roll off easier and it might help. It's kind of what we saw though, except that wasn't significant. And then it got really interesting that the fact where we put the plate longer was actually the one that made it most easy. So here you see energy cost, and the lower the value, the better the running economy. So if you just compare putting it forward versus backwards, backwards is numerically better, it wasn't significant. But then forwards with a plate extension is the best. And we're still trying to figure out what's going on and whether we need to test some more people to see whether these differences are real or not. But overall, small differences might be something going on. So going back to the overview, it's got to be the shoes. What have we learned today? We know that super shoes do improve running economy. It's not a gimmick. Nike didn't pay me to say this. It's true. There's scientific evidence all around for the past 7 years. We also know that better running economy allows people to run faster race times. We know that the foams seem to be more important than the plate, although the foam with a plate is still better than the foam without a plate. We know that just making the shoes taller is not going to give you a free extra long step. It's more complicated than that. And that rod curve geometry might have an effect, although we're getting to the point where these differences are so subtle that with the measures that we're taking for running economy, we might not be able to accurately capture them. So then it's just about, they might help, but again, it's less than 1%. So it's hard to actually quantify them and capture them for real. So I've got some extra time to tell you what I think is going to be happening within this field over the next few years. First thing that's already happening is the spikes. So all of this research until basically last year was all about marathon road running shoes, and people take them to the 10K and the half marathon. At the same time, brands start to use some of these insights from the road shoes and put them in spikes, but there was no science necessarily to back that up. And we sort of thought about this, and we know why that is. So, and you all should know that because I just told you about it earlier. When we measure running economy, it's very important that we assess people at a sub-maximal steady state where they rely purely on aerobic metabolism. If you look at spikes at middle distance events on the track, the athletes are most often far beyond their metabolic steady state, using a lot of anaerobic resources, which we can't really capture with our running economy measures. So we thought about this a little bit more. It's like, how can we do this? And we came up with this new approach where we know 800-meter runners, milers, they often do a lot of training sessions where they just do 200-meter repeats at their race pace effort. And they just know how to do that. They just go into it. It's called cruising. It's called, I don't know how they call it in the US, but there's different ways that people look at this, but it's very common training where they just do 200-meter repetitions at their race pace effort. And we thought, well, if we have enough of these and people don't know what shoes they're wearing, if the shoes actually make them run faster, they probably run these intervals faster, which is kind of a big would probably scenario. So we took a very rigorous approach, actually combined research from here with a group in Spain, with a group in Canada, to answer the question whether we could use this interval-based approach, whether it's valid, sensitive, reproducible, and when we can actually assess the spikes that people are currently using. So we did 4 experiments. The first one, we know that heavier shoes worsen your running economy. We also know that heavier shoes make you run slower. So we know that from maximal effort trials as well, but we thought, okay, let's see if we have spikes and people are unaware they're the exact same spikes, but one pair is 200 grams heavier than the other one. We know that they should slow down about 1.2% from what we collectively know as a field about the effect of shoe mass. And then here we see the results. Interestingly enough, on average, all of these runners in the study, the average was they slowed down about 1.2%, exactly like we predicted. So that was a nice confirmation of the validity. Then we saw, okay, are these super spikes measurably faster? So we actually evaluated a prototype super spike against a traditional spike, and we saw that people ran significantly faster, suggesting that this method is sensitive to this. And obviously we were like, well, you can see there's a lot of variability going on between people. How consistent are these findings? So then we had runners run 200 meter repetitions in different spikes, then they would go home, come back a week later, they do it again, and do it again a week later. So we got 3 days of data now, where they ran in the exact same spikes, and they did these 200 meter repetitions at self-perceived 800 meter race pace. And we saw at the group level that our findings were very consistent. We saw consistently that the prototype with foam only was better than the traditional, and that the prototype with a foam and a plate was even better. Although if you look at each and every individual of those people in the study, there are some differences. So some people liked the shoe with the foam, but no plate best. They ran faster in the shoe on day 1, and then in day 2, they might have run faster in the shoe with the plate and the foam. But that didn't happen that often, actually. We looked at these numbers, and we saw that very consistently people preferred the same shoe. There were a couple of exceptions, but then the numbers for every individual were slightly different. So on day 1, you would say, oh, the super spike with the plate is 5% better, and then on day 2, it was only 3%. So while we endorse this method to look at the group level, a little hesitant to just have the person do this once and then say, okay, this shoe is 3% better for you. You have to have them come back a couple of days and get an average value, but still, that seems feasible. So then we took this approach and evaluated. The biggest question that we first had is, are these modern super spikes actually better, or is this all marketing? And what we saw here is that both the Puma super spike and the Nike super spike were significantly better than the traditional. Unfortunately for Adidas, their super spike was not better. So very interesting findings there, and sort of explains or gives some scientific evidence for what we see on the track. Because at the same time, while we're doing, other people are analyzing race performances, and we do see that on average, elite track runners are running faster nowadays than they did a couple of years ago, again, most likely because of these spikes. So then obviously another question is, well, should all these spikes have a plate? Because there are some super spikes that are just bouncy foam, and there are some super spikes that are bouncy foam combined with a plate. So Victor looked more into this. We got the control spike, the PIBA spike, which PIBA is that fancy foam, so that only has a foam and no plate. And then there's the PIBA plus plate, which has that same foam and a plate. And here you see we did the 200 meter at 800 meter race pace for the women. You saw that they improved both with the PIBA and the PIBA plus plate. Numerically, there was not a difference between the PIBA and the plate. So for the women, on average, there was no difference between the two super spikes, meaning that some women ran faster in the super spike without the plate and some with, but they definitely ran faster than in the control spike. Then if we look to data for the men, we saw that for the men, only the PIBA with the plate performed significantly better. Again, this is for the 800 meter race pace trials. But then the biggest question that Victor had was, should we maybe use a spike with the plate for the 800 and a spike without the plate for the 1,000 meters? Because that's kind of how these spikes are marketed. The ones without the plates are called the long distance, and the ones with the plate are called the middle distance. So we have now 800 meter race pace results. You then also had people do a time trial, and a time trial for a 3K, and he saw basically the same thing though. Still, the PIBA with the plate was better. But then he did some running economy testing, and I just said that that's not cool for middle distances, but he did it to simulate the 10,000 meters, which more generally is an aerobic event. So he controlled people, their speed on the track, running in these spikes. And now our axis is actually not speed, but energy cost. So now lower is better again. And in this case, both are still better than the control, and they're not significantly different. But numerically, it seems that the energy cost is slightly lower in the PIBA versus PIBA and plate. So again, we still don't know this, but there seems to be something going on where for shorter events where you run faster, this plate might be beneficial versus the longer events where you run slower, you might not need it. even though for the marathon shoes, they all have one and they're definitely running even slower. And there might be some individual variability where strong runners might have more benefit of a plate than skinny endurance runners. Again, this is all unknown at this point, but we have the tools now to dig further into these questions. So I think the whole field is moving towards these individual responses. There's all this talk about non-responders to super shoes and responders and whether it's fair or not fair. And then eventually we're also going to be able to personalize shoes for individuals. But when we can build shoes that we can individualize, we actually need to know what the individual needs, right? So I think our field still needs to make a lot of progress finding out what's better for me than for Erland, for Monty, versus Kath. So there's all these differences between people and what's going to predict which shoes are going to be best for them. We have no clue at all. There's some stories about these super responses and non-responders. As a lab, we're not necessarily a fan of this, particularly since some of these studies, they just do one running economy trial in one shoe. We have been doing this a lot, and we kind of know that if you just take one measurement, it might not be capturing the actual response. You probably want to take a couple of them and take the average. So Zach and Victor and Monty wrote this up, sort of saying like, be careful by taking outrageous conclusions from data points where you only have one data point. If you really want to claim that some East African runners benefit 10%, you probably want to have them run a couple of times in those shoes before you start broadcasting that. Again, this is just, we wrote this up, but it's very common from other fields, and it's not just for shoes. It's generally, when looking at metabolic cost and running economy, there's just some variability going on, and before you want to use that result to make bold claims, you probably want to measure it a couple of times to be sure that what you see is consistent. The other thing that we're seeing is we conquered the road. I just talked about spikes. The next battleground is the trail running. Problem is trails are different everywhere. A trail here is different from a trail in Colorado, in California versus Mont Blanc. So there's not going to be one solution here for a super shoe. The one thing that we are trying to figure out is what the effect of slopes is. So we're doing a current study where we're going up this steep treadmill that you see Monty demoing. And at some point you can imagine that with these stiffer shoes, if you're going up these steep grades, you kind of no longer have a benefit, but it might actually be worse if your shoes don't flex enough so that you can actually adapt to the slope of the surface. So we have some preliminary data suggesting that that is the case, but you have to go very steep, and there are not that many races that are actually that steep. So it sounds that for most races, the plate is not necessarily a problem. What is a problem is probably that stack height on that uneven terrain where you might roll your ankle slightly easier if you have very tall shoes going over bumps. Then we're also going away from the lab. Treadmills are fun, but it's nice to do this on actual trails. So we have some preliminary data or making progress towards quantifying some of these outcomes on the track versus on the trails. It would also be fun to put some motion capture cameras in UMass's new track facility once that is finished. Then other stuff that I'm really excited about, and since we're in the cell building, we're going to look into some local energetics of foot muscles together with Raja and Elena. Don't want to talk too much about that because we don't know if it's going to work at all, but we're going to try. And then my group is also collaborating with Megan Uber's group on some robotic shoes, basically airbags that we inflate. And then with Seth trying to 3D print shoes and take that from, and both of these projects are not necessarily targeted running at this point. We start with walking and people that are on their feet all day, but maybe some of these learnings can eventually be used to make running shoes even better. So to summarize, again, I already told you about these. Just want to add that the super responder claims lack solid scientific evidence, and that the super spikes are here, but the super trail shoes are not, and they might never be, because it's just a complex puzzle to solve. And with that, I want to acknowledge everybody helped me put this together. People in my lab, people who used to be in my lab, funding sources, Puma and Saucony, obviously all study participants who are very thankful to. And with that, happy to take questions.